Greetings, this is Krill of Krill Inspires. Welcome back to the channel. Welcome if this is your first time. My name is Krill. I am the host of the Out the Box TV show on YouTube, but I'm also a seasoned interview podcaster. And I'm also an author of the book, Creating a Successful Interview Podcast, a how-to guide, where I give you tips on things that you can do to help develop a successful interview podcast. So today I want to talk about a topic from my book, Creating a Successful Interview Podcast. And this is Guide 8, which deals with the topic of avoiding filler words or avoiding vocal fillers. Now, if you caught my last video, I spoke about avoiding filler responses. So we're going to talk a little bit about what filler words are and why it's important to avoid them. All right. So what are filler words? How do they differ from filler responses? Well, filler words are usually said by the interviewer when they're asking a question. They tend to be said in the middle of the question or at moments in between the question when an interviewer stumbles to find the next words to complete the question. A question with filler words may sound something like this. I want to ask you how you learned how to produce music while you were living in California. Did you notice some pauses and some slower pace happening with my wording of that question? If you did, then you probably recognize the moments where I was using filler words. All right. So the parts where I said or you know, those are what you would call filler words or vocal fillers. The thing is, we say these words all the time. I mean, we say it in conversation. We say it when we're doing public speaking. We say it, obviously, when we do interviews, right? If you're conducting an interview. And it is natural to say these words, but too much filler words or vocal fillers can sound a bit unprofessional, and it can also be distracting from delivering a good question, right? So what I mean by distracting is if you're using too many filler words, what can happen is as your guest is listening to your question, they might lose track of what you're really trying to ask because you have so many different pauses, which are these filler words that deviate from a clear, straight-cut question. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some strategies that you can use to lessen filler words. Sort of like the filler responses that I talked about in the last video, it is not necessary to completely avoid filler words or vocal fillers 100%. But you want to do it as much as possible. If you can manage to ask every question without having to include a vocal filler or a filler word, then your presentation of your interview is going to sound so good and it's going to sound so professional. But if you throw in a or in there occasionally, it doesn't hurt. But you don't want to do it too much. And what is too much? I would say no more than 2 or 3 times or more than that while you're asking a question. All right. So let's go into some strategies you can use to avoid filler words like or you know or right. I have to say, I actually end up using a lot of filler words myself, and I got to correct myself. But I've learned over time how to avoid them as much as possible, right? So I've gotten a lot better than I was when I first started out doing interviews. And I'm telling you, it makes you cringe when you go back and play your interview, how many times you might have said it. Sometimes you say it and you don't even realize you're saying it. So it's why I want to show you what you can do to avoid and lessen filler words or vocal fillers as much as possible. Let's give an example of a question that features a filler word, right? So you may say something like, hey, I noticed in your bio that you grew up in California. What was it about growing up in California that made you the person that you are today? So you notice I said at least 2 times, right? And those 2 moments where I said, I was struggling a bit to find what my next word was going to be, or I found a place in the question that I was not in rhythm with completing my question. Those are 2 valid reasons why one would use a filler word. Now, the filler word I used was and are probably the most common filler words. People use that a lot. Sometimes when you hear or right, it doesn't sound that bad. But the ahs and the ums, I find, man, those words, those are the words you got to look out for, or those are the sounds you got to look out for. So, like I said, it tends to happen when you are having difficulty finding the next word to say in your question. Or it may happen because you just find yourself not in rhythm of asking your question. A lot of times, if your mind is not focused on the question that you're asking, you can mess up and use some filler words in between. So you may find yourself in a position where you're ready to go with the question, but for some reason your mind drifted off in the middle of the question because you thought about something else while you were asking the question. And then during that period, that small time where your mind drifted off, you ended up using a filler word. It can happen like that too. All right. So one of the first things you want to do to avoid using filler words or lessen using filler words is to remember to take a silent pause. So at that moment where you are about to say a filler word, or you find yourself stuck as to what my next word is going to be, just be silent. But in order for you to be silent, the most important thing is to be cognizant, is to be aware going into the question that you're going to make sure that you're silent if you find yourself having to pause. Okay, so that is extremely important. You have to be aware. So you literally have to go into the interview saying to yourself, you know what? I'm going to put my best foot forward, and I'm going to aim not to use any filler words. And that way, if I end up using maybe 1 or 2, then I know that it's still better than using a lot, because I went into it with the intention that I was going to be silent, or I was going to pause during those stumbling block periods where I would tend to use a filler word. Okay, so first and foremost, make sure that you are, as you're going into the interview, that you're going to be cognizant of being silent or pausing for that little bit of time as you gather your thoughts for what your next question, your next word is going to be. Now, I know some people may think, well, pausing may cause you to sound like you're not professional. Or in radio, they call this thing dead air, where you don't hear anyone speaking for a period of time. You know, the interesting thing about pausing, even if you paused for like 3 or 4 seconds, like I just did, right? It doesn't take away from the quality of the interview, right? It doesn't take away from your professionalism as a host. In fact, it actually makes you sound professional, I would argue, even more at times, because the guest is paying attention to you and the listener is also paying attention to you. So the guest is paying attention to you, and he's probably saying, wow, this guy is actually taking his time. He's not rushing the interview. And you know what it's doing for the listener? The listener, the audience, is actually benefiting from understanding the question as well, because it's giving them time to process the question. Okay, so when you pause, it's giving the listener or the viewer of the interview some time to say, you know what? I can gather what he's saying or what he's asking, because it's slowing down the question. Okay, so that's another reason why pausing is actually a good thing. Another thing to keep in mind is to get comfortable with taking pauses so you can be comfortable with the idea of silence. Okay, so you have to also be comfortable with it. Try talking a little slower than you usually would, and try stretching out important words by emphasizing them strongly. For instance, so I'm going to ask this next question and I'm going to include filler words. Okay, so it goes like this. I would like to ask you about your upbringing and how you went from little league basketball into, you know, professional wrestling. So you notice I use you know, and again, right? So I use a number of filler words there. Now let me show you how I can ask that same question and not use filler words, but use this different technique called slowing down the words. Okay, so here's how it goes. I would like to ask you about your upbringing and how you went from little league basketball to professional wrestling. Did you notice that there were some key words that I emphasized and I stretched them out a little longer, right? So one of the key words was upbringing that I stretched. I stretched the word basketball, and I also stretched or emphasized the word wrestling. So what happens is the listener pays attention to this, and they'll be more likely to understand what you're saying if you take your time with asking the questions. Okay. The other important thing to remember about taking your time is that you want the guest to understand your question the first time you ask it. So it's okay if you got to repeat the question sometimes, but I'm going to tell you this. When you ask a question in one take and it's delivered in a clear and concise way, it's nothing more professional than that when it comes to asking a question. All right. So keep that in mind. It's important to take your time so that your guest understands the question you asked the first time. Okay. Practice is going to be really helpful with this guide. Having your questions written out and rehearsed is helpful to the practice and will naturally avoid a lot of filler words because it will enable you to be familiar with how your words and the delivery will come across in your questions. So some takeaways to share with this tip is to remember, be intentional and mindful about speaking slower while asking questions, and also practice pausing and intentional silence as you gather your next words to complete your question. Thank you so much for tuning in for this video, and I hope that you found some of the information valuable here today. I am available for consulting if you are someone that's looking to get some one-on-one support. So I have the link in the description of this video if you want to book a session with me so that I can hear exactly where you are on your podcasting journey and the goals you would like to achieve. And I can assist you directly on achieving those goals based on my expertise and experience as an interview podcaster. Thank you again for tuning into the video. And if you have not liked and subscribed the channel and you like what you see, definitely feel encouraged to subscribe. All right. Thank you so much. I'll catch you all on the next video. You have a good one. Take it easy.